This is not breaking news. This is not a scandal. This is not about one person. This is about something quieter and far more dangerous, because while everyone argues about power, who has it, who lost it, who abused it, the system itself has already changed. Not loudly, not suddenly, but permanently. What used to be enforced with force is now enforced with access. What used to require troops now requires infrastructure. What used to look like domination now looks like cooperation. And most people don't notice it until they are already inside it. Because this system doesn't punish you when you resist, it rewards you when you comply. It makes you dependent before you realize you're vulnerable. And once that dependency is built, there is no emergency exit. If you think this story is about a foreign country, it isn't. If you think it's about ideology, it's not. This is about a model that is being refined, tested, and reused. If you stay with me, you'll see how it works and why it matters now. Because the next part isn't about who's in charge. It's about what actually is. The mistake we keep making is looking for a person at the center of this. A presidente, a regime, a villain. But that's not what controls the system anymore. What controls it now is permission, permission to sell, permission to move money, permission to move resources through pipes, ports, and contracts that someone else maintains. Power no longer sits in offices. It sits in switches, and the people who hold those switches don't need to give orders. They only need to allow continuity or interrupt it. That's the shift. The system is no longer organized around who governs. It's organized around who integrates. Once you are integrated into infrastructure you don't own, financing you can't replace, and revenue you can't interrupt without collapsing yourself, your choice is narrow. You can still vote. You can still speak. You can still declare independence, but none of that changes who controls the flow. And here's the part that's easy to miss. This system doesn't arrive with a threat. It arrives with an offer, and that's where the danger actually begins. Because to understand what's happening next, you have to see what changed quietly while everyone was watching something else. The most dangerous changes don't feel like changes at all. They feel like maintenance. There was a time when control looked obvious. Borders mattered. Ownership mattered. A country ran its own systems, even when it failed. And then, slowly, that shifted. Before, power broke things to prove it had arrived. Now, power fixes things. Before, intervention meant pressure from the outside. Now, it means repair from the inside. Broken infrastructure becomes an invitation. Neglect becomes an argument. Collapse becomes leverage. Because once something essential stops working, energy, transport, revenue, the question is no longer who should control it. The question becomes who can, and when the answer is not you, the rest follows quietly. This didn't happen overnight. It happened through normalization. Each step felt reasonable. Each decision felt temporary. Each dependency felt technical, not political, until temporary became structural, and by the time anyone noticed, control had already changed hands. Without a single formal transfer. That's the shift you have to understand. Because once a system learns it can replace force with functionality, it doesn't go back. And the first real shock that proves this isn't theory comes next. Then something visible happens. Not a war, not an invasion, a release. People who had been held quietly for years suddenly walk free. Families reunite. Cameras turn on. The moment is framed as progress. And almost immediately, something else stops. Plans that were already in motion are paused. Escalation that was assumed to be inevitable isn't coincidence. It's calibration. A single act is treated as proof of reasonableness, as a signal, as a down payment. The message is subtle but precise. Behavior can be exchanged for safety. Compliance can be rewarded with relief. Nothing structural has changed yet. No system has been rebuilt. No power has shifted on paper. But the rules of interaction have been rewritten. If one gesture can deactivate pressure, what else can be traded? And if freedom itself can function as currency, what happens when the price goes up? Because this moment isn't the story, it's the test. And what it unlocks next is far more consequential than what just ended. Here's what that moment actually activates. Not diplomacy, not trust, infrastructure. Because once pressure is lifted, even briefly, something else moves in. Engineers, capital, contracts. This is where the system reveals itself. Rebuilding isn't neutral. Repair isn't generous. Whoever fixes what's broken decides how it works afterward. Money doesn't arrive as aid. It arrives as structure. It dictates timelines, standards, interfaces, and the damage doesn't disappear. It gets absorbed by the state that can't refuse the fix, by the workforce that doesn't control the terms, by a government that needs the system running more than it needs autonomy. The benefits are concentrated. The risks are socialized. If the system succeeds, the operators profit. If it fails, the country absorbs the fallout. And here's the part that's easiest to miss. Once operations restart, stopping them becomes impossible. Revenue begins to flow. Expectations reset. Dependency hardens. At that point, control doesn't need to be asserted. It's already embedded. And once embedded, it only becomes visible when something else breaks again, which is exactly what happens next. Then reality pushes back. Not politically. Technically, the system doesn't restart smoothly. It stutters. Old lines fail. Outdated pipelines leak. Facilities built decades ago can't handle modern demand. Costs surge. Timelines stretch. Every fix reveals another failure underneath it. And now speed matters. Because once production is expected, delay becomes instability. Workers wait. Markets watch. Revenue projections harden into obligations. There's no room for pause anymore. The state can't stop the process. It can't fund it alone. And it can't renegotiate without risking collapse. So control tightens, not through force, but through urgency. Every day offline is money lost. Every interruption is a threat. Every complaint sounds like sabotage. At this stage, no one needs to issue warnings. The system disciplines itself, and the pressure no longer comes from outside actors. It comes from inside the country, from people who now need the flow to continue at any cost. That's when dependency stops being abstract, because the moment people rely on the system to survive, they will defend it, even if it isn't theirs. And that changes who gets hurt next. This is where you enter the story. Because once a system like this locks in, it doesn't just reshape governments, it reshapes lives. If you live there, your job depends on continuity. Your wages depend on exports. Your stability depends on prices you don't set and infrastructure you don't control. If the flow stops, it's not abstract. It's immediate. Stores empty. Public services stall. Savings evaporate. And here's the trap. The more the system works, the harder it is to question it. People don't defend the structure because they believe in it. They defend it because they need it. That's how leverage migrates from contracts into households. And once that happens, resistance stops looking heroic. It starts looking irresponsible. If this feels distant, it isn't. Because the logic doesn't stop at borders. Stay with me. Because what happens to one economy under this model never stays contained. The next step is where this stops being local and starts becoming a pattern. Once the flow resumes, it doesn't just stabilize one country. It recalibrates everything around it. Energy markets adjust. Prices soften. Supply chains rebalance. What looks like relief in one place becomes pressure somewhere else. Because when one system gains a new controlled source of output, others lose leverage. Producers that relied on scarcity suddenly compete with abundance. Allies reassess, rivals adapt, and quietly, the center of gravity shifts. This is no longer about extraction, it's about alignment. Who can plug in, who can't, who becomes replaceable. The model spreads not because it's imposed, but because it works. Countries watching this don't see coercion. They see stability, and stability is persuasive, especially in a world exhausted by volatility. But here's the risk. When multiple systems begin relying on the same stabilizing mechanism, any disruption becomes systemic. What was once a bilateral arrangement turns into a global dependency. And at that scale, control stops being strategic. It becomes structural, which raises the question that no one wants to answer yet. What happens when the switch gets used? From here, the system can move in three directions. The first is adjustment. Everything keeps working, the flow stabilizes. Revenue grows, dependence becomes routine. Over time, the system stops feeling imposed. It feels normal, necessary, inevitable. Control exists, but it's rarely exercised because it doesn't need to be. The second path is erosion. Small disruptions appear, technical disputes, contractual friction, political signals that don't align. Nothing dramatic, just enough instability to remind everyone where the leverage actually sits. Compliance increases quietly. Choices narrow gradually. Autonomy erodes without a single announcement. And then there's the third path. Rupture. A decision breaks alignment. The flow is interrupted. Revenue stalls, not as punishment. As consequence, the system reacts faster than governments can. Markets move, jobs vanish. Pressure turns inward. At that point, the question isn't sovereignty anymore. It's survival. And here's the part that matters. None of these paths require invasion. None require regime change. None require public justification. The system handles it on its own, which is why the final danger isn't which path is chosen. It's that the choice may no longer belong to the people living inside it. So this doesn't end with a collapse. It ends with a question. Because once a system like this exists, it doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to threaten. It doesn't even need to be used often. It just needs to be there. A structure where prosperity is conditional, where stability is rented, not owned, where survival depends on staying connected to systems you didn't design and can't replace. That's the danger. Not that one country loses control, but that this model becomes normal, that we stop recognizing dependency as power, that we confuse integration with autonomy, that we accept a world where the most effective form of control is making collapse feel self-inflicted. And if you're wondering why this matters now, why this story keeps repeating in different places, with different resources, under different justifications, that's not an accident. This isn't the end of the story. It's the architecture of the next one. If you want to understand where this model appears next, who's already inside it, and how close it gets to home, stay with me. Because once you see the system clearly, you start noticing it everywhere. And by then, opting out is no longer a simple choice.